Next slide, please. I'm Tim Gosar, coordinator for the Larimer Alliance, and I'm very excited about tonight's webinar. I'm very pleased you've given us your time out of your busy schedule to be with us tonight. Thank you. On the screen, you see displayed a couple of upcoming opportunities for public comment and participation. Tomorrow, April 13th at 3:30, the Larimer Board of County Commissioners is having a special land use meeting where they'll be discussing continuing or not the moratorium on considering oil and gas applications in Larimer County past April 15th of this year. The link to the sign up to be a part of tomorrow's meeting you should see in the chat. Please consider signing up and participating in tomorrow's virtual meeting and voicing your support for a continuation of the moratorium until at least the end of July, when the oil and gas regulations should be completed. On the screen, you'll see Larimer County's timeline for public participation in the events they're offering regarding the oil and gas regulations and its processes. The link to this timeline is posted in the chat as well. That should be the next slide, Andrew. There we go. The Larimer Alliance has been fortunate to be able to secure a few generous donations recently. These donors have agreed to match up to $1,000 in contributions, which is really unbelievable. Please help us realize these matching funds. Any help you'd be able to give us would be greatly appreciated and used extremely wisely. You'll see posted in the chat the different ways to support the Larimer Alliance, its work, and the wonderful matching opportunity. Please help us realize the entire $1,000. Thank you so much in advance for any help you'd be able to give us. Next slide. If you've been wanting to join a group tackling the oil and gas impacts on Larimer County, please consider joining the Larimer Alliance. If tonight's webinar moves you to want to work on something like this, we would love to have you. We're always looking for help. Our website is posted in the chat, larimeralliance.org. I just wanted to take a little bit of time to recognize some of the great people I work with in the Larimer Alliance and their amazing work that helped bring you this event. These people are Doug Henderson, Gayla Martinez, Ed Bean, Elena Lopez, Rick Casey, Lori Brunswick, Tom Rhodes, and Sarah Johnson. Their contribution to this event and their work has been nothing short of amazing. Thank you, team. One of our partner organizations that has been so instrumental in our work and been so supportive and helpful to the Larimer Alliance is Logic. True synergy is what Logic has helped us create. A special thanks to Sarah, Andrew, and Logic. I now want to hand the program over to Logic's Deputy Director, Andrew Forkas Skumanson, who will moderate tonight's event. Thank you, Andrew, and it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Tim, for the kind words and the introduction. My name's Andrew Forkas Goodmanson. I'm the Deputy Director of Logic, the League of Oil and Gas Impacted Coloradans. It is my honor and joy to be moderating and facilitating this discussion this evening. I am extremely excited to be joined by this august panel of experts on air quality and oil and gas issues in Colorado. As we sort of briefly discussed up front while people were trickling in, I'd like to introduce each of my panelists and give them opportunity to say a brief introductory remark about themselves, and then we'll hop right into what should be a rousing discussion on air quality issues and what we can do about it at the various levels of government that we're dealing with here in Colorado. So first, this is not in any ranked order, you're just first on my list, we have Mr. Mike Foote, who is a former state representative and senator who helped draft SB 19181, which is kind of what brings us all here. Mike is an attorney who is going to be on this panel to highlight how changes in Colorado law now enable local governments to protect their communities. Mike.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Thanks everyone for joining us. I look forward to having the discussion. I'm sure we'll be doing some Q&A as well. And I can guarantee that it'll be interesting that what we're talking about tonight. I can't really guarantee that at least I will be very august, but we'll do our best to make sure that you have a good presentation. So thanks again.
Thanks, Mike. August was on my word of the day calendar a while back, so I wanted to make sure to sneak it in. Up next, I have Elise Jones. Elise is the Executive Director of the Southwest Energy Efficiency Project, or SWEEP. She's a former Boulder County Commissioner and a current member of the Colorado Air Quality Control Commission. Elise is going to bring her knowledge and experience as a policymaker and an organizer, heading a group promoting more efficient and sustainable public energy systems. Elise.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks everybody for tuning in. It's really great to be here tonight. This was a really important topic, and while I approach this topic from, as a recovering politician, an environmental advocate of a, nonprofit director and a member of the Air Quality Control Commission, I think probably the most important perspective is as the mother of a 16-year-old daughter and really concerned about the planet. And it's something a value I'm sure all of you share. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I too won't promise to be august, but I'll be spirited.
That's all we can ask. One of you must promise to be august, though, or you'll make a liar of me. Up next, we have Laurie Anderson, Broomfield City Council member, a resident of Broomfield, an engineer, and also a mother. Laurie will be speaking about Broomfield's efforts to protect residents and neighborhoods from the harmful emissions of oil and gas development. Laurie?
Thank you, Andrew. And I am also very happy to be here. And we have so many residents joining us tonight. And I look forward to a much more in-depth discussion of local regulations on air quality. They're very exciting topics. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurie. And last but certainly not least, we have Andrew Klooster. He's on staff with, he is the Colorado, I'm going to screw up your title because it just changed, I think, recently. I have written down the Colorado Field Organizer for Earthworks. I'll let him correct his title when I let him talk. Andrew's going to be showing and explaining some images associated with actual emissions from oil and gas operations using what's called a forward-looking infrared camera, or FLIR technology. We'll be discussing the implications for these emissions and what we can do to address them in Larimer County and all along the North Front Range. Andrew.
Thank you. And yeah, it's Colorado Field Advocate as of January. No worries at all. It did just recently change, so no worries. And I thank you again, Andrew. Thanks, Logic, Larimer Alliance, all the panelists, and everyone who is attending today. Hope to have a really good discussion about some of these issues and share with you all some of our expertise from the kind of various experiences that we have, all the panelists. And I guess I will try to be august, although I'm not exactly sure what that will entail, but I'll give it my best.
I think that's all we can ask of any of us. So before we get into the panel discussion, as I mentioned, I did want to lay out what are essentially some ground rules for tonight, not for the panelists. They're not really rules. It's more suggestions on how to make this flow better. We have a lot of material to cover, and the panelists that we've assembled today are experts in their field who have a lot of knowledge to share with us. And as such, there's kind of a lot to cover. So I'll be trying to facilitate the discussion as much as I can and to make sure we stay as focused as we can. And to that end, we'll be holding all questions until the end. There are a couple of Larimer Alliance folks who are going to be watching the chat for me so I don't get too distracted. And they will be taking questions that you put in the chat and dropping them into a Google Doc for us to follow at the end. So if something comes up during the discussion that you're interested in and want to learn more about, please drop a question in the chat. If you have a panelist who you would particularly like to direct the question to, please include that when you put the question in the chat. And then we're going to try and reserve a decent amount of time at the end here to get to Q&A. So please bear with us. We've all been living in a Zoom world for quite a while, but it's never flawless. So we ask your indulgence for any weird tech issues, or if we're all unmuted, or whatever. If someone's spouse walks into the room and starts dancing in the background, let's just go with it and have a little dance party. So with that, I'm going to kick it off with the first question, which is really, really easy. And that is, Elise, can you start a discussion about what air quality in general looks like along the Front Range, particularly in Larimer County, and how you think oil and gas contributes to it? Simple, minor question. Should be
piece of cake. Let's dive in. All right, first slide then. And I'll start talking. So believe it or not, over the last couple of years, in general, our state and regional air quality has improved, particularly for pollutants like lead and carbon monoxide and sulfur dioxide, which we've done a good job of controlling. However, our population is growing, we're drilling more, we're driving more, and the result is a big fat F from the American Lung Association. And the oil and gas development contributes to these air challenges in several major ways. As you know, it's a major source for ozone, produces hazardous air pollutants and particulates, which are particularly concerning locally near oil and gas sites. It's a major source of climate pollution, both through combustion of fossil fuels for electricity, heating, industry, transportation, and from the methane that's released during the oil and gas production process. So oil and gas does play a large role in our air quality challenges. So let's start with ozone. As you can see from this, our bad grade from the American Lung Association is based largely on ozone or smog. And ozone isn't emitted directly. It is the combination. It's created when volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, are mixed with nitrogen oxide, or NOx. We'll probably be talking about them all night, combined in the presence of sunlight. And it happens more readily when it's warmer. So we really see ozone spikes on hot, sunny summer days. It also means that climate change will make this whole thing worse. So the two top contributors to ozone in our region are vehicles and oil and gas. Vehicles, cars and trucks, are the major source in the southern part of the metro area. Think of Denver and all the traffic. But from Boulder to Fort Collins North, the major contributor is oil and gas. And some people like to say, hey, but Boulder County in Colorado actually has a lot of pollution, not Boulder County. Colorado has a lot of ozone pollution blowing in from other states, and we have wildfires that we can't control, and it's not our fault. So we should get exemptions from having to, meet standards. First of all, it doesn't matter where the pollution is coming from. Coloradans deserve to breathe clean air. And two, we know from the Front Range Air Pollution and Photochemistry Experiment, or FRAPE, which might ring a bell with you, flyovers that were done a couple years ago, that both oil and gas and vehicles contribute about 30 to 40% of the total ozone production on the days where ozone exceeds the health standard. So we can actually impact our ozone levels and make a difference if we can control those. So EPA updated the ozone standard to 75 parts per billion in 2008, but recognized years later that wasn't strong enough, so made it more stringent to 70 parts per billion. And what makes it a little confusing is that both of those standards are currently in effect. And the way right now, ozone is measured continuously. It monitors around the state. And how they determine if you're in compliance is you take the fourth highest daily 8-hour concentration and you average that over a consecutive 3-year period. So next slide. Our 9-county Denver Metro Northern Front Range area has been out of compliance for ozone since 2004. And right now we're in serious non-attainment with the 2008, which is the 75 parts per billion standard. And because of our horrendous air quality summer last year and our wildfires, we are going to be downgraded to severe non-attainment. And we'll need to be meeting that deadline sometime in 2021. Next slide. This graph sort of illustrates where we are. The dashed red line is the ozone standard. You can see how it's been dropped over the years to be more protective. The colored line shows the readings at some of the various monitors around the state. The purple line is the Fort Collins West monitor. And this doesn't include our awful 2020 summer, but you can see very clearly from this that we are not yet anywhere near meeting the 2015 70 parts per billion standard. And next slide, if you add in what happened last summer, this is a really busy slide. Just look at the final column on the right. The numbers you see in red and orange are all of the monitors that didn't meet one of the ozone standards in 2020. And that just really illustrates the challenge we're up against in terms of meeting these ozone standards and how important it is that we do more than we are now. When you're out of attainment with the Clean Air Act standard, you have to develop a state implementation plan, which we've done, and it's supposed to show how we're going to achieve compliance. When you get downgraded, as we will, we have to rewrite that plan and add more emission controls. And as part of that, they lower the threshold for the pollution sources that get regulated. So you start off at about 100 tons per year of NOx or VOCs. Those are the sources that are regulated. When you drop down to serious non-attainment, that's half to 50. And when we get downgraded to severe non-attainment, we will have to regulate sources of pollution that emit only 25 tons per year, which will probably include a lot more oil and gas sites. So that is our future, trying to deal with ozone. Another huge pollutant that's less about health and more about climate is methane. As you know, methane is the primary constituent of natural gas. It's 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide in terms of its warming impact over a 20-year period. And one of the concerning things about oil and gas production is how much it leaks. Research done by EDF found that the methane leakage rate is 60% higher than what EPA has predicted. And you've probably heard people talking about how natural gas is supposed to be some bridge fuel because it only burns half as dirty as coal. But if you have a leakage rate of even somewhere in the neighborhood of 3% of the natural gas produced, if it leaks during the production process, natural gas's advantage over coal goes away from a climate standpoint. So these are really important emissions to control as well. We'll talk about that more later today. I'm not going to talk about hazardous air pollutants because I think Andrew and Laurie are, but I will talk a little bit about the air monitoring that we've did in Boulder County that really illustrates the connection that oil and gas has on air quality. Back in 2017, we teamed up with Dr. Detlev Helmig and the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment to really find out what's the impact that oil and gas development is having. And we put up extra monitor at the Boulder Reservoir site outside of Boulder and measured, and we still do, ozone, NOx, methane, VOCs, including hazardous ones like benzene and ethane and propane, which serve as tracer pollutants, so you know whether or not the emissions are actually coming from oil and gas rather than traffic. And the major findings from that monitoring was that they also measured wind direction. And when the winds blow from Weld County, from the northeast, as you know, Weld County is the epicenter of oil and gas drilling in Colorado. When the winds blow from the northeast, we get higher concentrations of ethane, propane, methane associated with oil and gas emissions. What's more, those oil and gas emissions were correlated with when we exceed the ozone standard at the Boulder Reservoir site. And that research was pretty pivotal in helping people understand that when it comes to oil and gas, local control is important, but it is not enough, that we need statewide protections because the emissions blow across the border. So really a partnership between local action and statewide action, and that helped, I think, pave the way for passage of Senate Bill 181 as well. Next slide, and last slide. Since then, Dr. Helmig has also partnered with other local communities, Longmont, Broomfield, and set up monitors there. And he has put together this website. You can see the name of the website at the top, boulder.air.com, NOCO Front Range. Excuse me, where all of the data, which is in real time, is combined on the same website. So you can compare monitors across several communities and get a sense of what's happening on all of these different pollutants. So it's a really great resource. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to, I believe, Andrew, to take us to the next level of understanding on the air pollutants from oil and gas facilities.
Yeah, Andrew, and I think, Elise, we might have some follow-up questions for you as a part of that. But
okay.
Oh, and fortunately, thank you to Ed for dropping all these links in the chat. So if you're following along, have that chat window open. I think Ed and Sarah are going to be trying to keep up with us as we mention various websites and online resources. So Andrew, Elise segued wonderfully into our next question for you, which is, this gives us a sort of general sense of the sort of large scale general impacts of oil and gas development, but you at Earthworks spent a lot of time collecting visual data on what the actual emissions from actual facilities look like on an acute level. So what do those emissions look like? What kind of emissions do we typically see from oil and gas facilities?
Yeah, and this is great because I can just, rather than fumbling between stopping sharing and not sharing, I will just continue forward with my slides. So I've prepared a couple of slides just to share with you all some examples of the sorts of emissions that we typically see. And just before I jump into that really quickly, just to reemphasize, I guess, what Andrew kind of stated in the introduction, if you're not familiar with Earthworks and our work and what we do, we use optical gas imaging cameras. So these are industry standard cameras to detect the emissions they're invisible to the naked eye, but the same emissions that Elise was just mentioning. So methane and VOCs in particular are what we are looking at when we're looking at oil and gas facilities. And these are what our OGI cameras can film and record and document that you would not be able to see with your naked eye. So this allows us to work with local communities, work with local municipalities to kind of identify oil and gas sites that people may be concerned about, maybe too close to homes, maybe there are somebody smelling odors or having health impacts. We look at these sites, if we see emissions and we document emissions, we share those with residents, we share those with local municipalities, we share those with the state agencies such as the CDPHE to hopefully, on one hand, rein in these emissions that we're detecting and also raise awareness about just the scale of this problem. So there are a variety of different emissions that we detect at all different types of sites. So, oil and gas sites ranging from small single well pads to multi-well pads to processing facilities, production facilities, storage facilities, midstream operations. And we detect emissions. We've detected emissions at really well sites at every stage of their life cycle. I'll say from the pre-production phase, which is typically a really emissions heavy phase, especially for a fracking well during the fracking flowback stages, but we also detect emissions at active well sites, producing well sites, and also sites that are inactive or temporarily abandoned or shut in. So really, we've detected emissions at all manner of sites, and we detect them for a variety of reasons. So right here on this slide, I'm highlighting leaks, and for the next couple of slides, I'll highlight leaks, but we've detected emissions because of equipment malfunctions, leaks. Sometimes combustors on sites are not working properly or efficiently. Depending on the production event going on, if it's during a fracking phase or a flowback phase, we might detect emissions. And also during maintenance events, when tanks may be venting to relieve pressure on a well, we've detected emissions. So in quick summation, before I talk a little bit more about the visuals, any site can potentially produce emissions or be producing emissions at almost any stage of its life cycle. And that's just something I want to emphasize before I talk really specifically, show some examples. So diving into the examples themselves, this is a site just north of Fort Collins in Larimer County, which I decided to highlight tonight because it's a site that we just started looking at actually this year. So we went in January of this year for the first time to look at this site. Some community members brought it to our attention. They smelled odors, were concerned about it. We filmed it in late January. And as you can see, so on the left-hand side of the slide is a digital photo image. This is the naked eye view of this tank on the site. On the right-hand side is a GIF, an animated GIF that shows what our OGI camera detected. So these emissions coming off of this tank were not visible to the naked eye. They are some combination of methane and VOCs. Our camera doesn't speciate, but it can show us what is being emitted. So you can see, especially you may have the panelist heads may be in your way a little bit. If you have the ability to hide the boxes for your view, if you'd like to do that, to see this image a little bit better. But on the image, you can see emissions coming off of the top of the tank. And we submitted a complaint to the CDPHE based on this footage and found from their investigation that this tank was poorly maintained and almost porous in spots. And so it was leaking off the top. We returned to the exact same site. This is the same site. This is a different set of tanks in early March, and found that the leak that we had initially detected on those previous tanks had indeed been repaired by the operator due to that CDPHE investigation. But we found a new leak coming off of the hatches of these crude oil storage tanks, which was then brought to the attention of the CDPHE. The operator made additional repairs. Ideally, this would have been the end of the story. However, we returned just a couple of weeks ago And as you can see in this image, there are still some telltale signs of emissions coming off of that hatch on top of this tank. So this site, one, because it's in Larimer County and we're talking about Larimer County in particular tonight, but also two, because this is just a single site, but it's indicative of, I would say, a larger problem that we see when we're doing field work, especially when it comes to leaks, is just how persistent and pervasive they can be. And we make a practice of returning to sites where we've detected leaks in the past, because unfortunately, inevitably, we're going to probably find additional leaks or emission events on return visits. I also really quickly mentioned maintenance events when I was kind of giving my brief overview. This was another site we looked at. This is not in Larimer County, it's in Weld County, just south of Longmont. We looked at this in January. The image on the right of the tank with the OGI, you can see a plume of emissions coming off of this tank and drifting across this field. After a CDPHE investigation prompted by this video, we found out that this was due to a liquids unloading event. So that's a maintenance event on site. They were venting this tank to reduce pressure while they were performing maintenance. What's concerning about this, and we've detected similar sorts of emissions from similar maintenance events, is that these are potentially routine, frequent, permissible things that occur at sites. So if you're a local resident, if you live nearby this site, that plume of emissions, finding out that that may be a routine thing potentially raises some alarm bells, because that's a pretty concerning plume of emissions. And then finally, just one last visual example I want to share before I turn it over to the rest of the panelists. This is just a picture of a site in pre-production. This is Coyote Trails in Erie, Colorado, in Weld County from 2018 when it was in pre-production. And as I mentioned, pre-production can be one of the more emissions heavy stages of a well's life. And there's a short video, and I'm not going to show all of it, but I'm going to exit out of this presentation really quickly because I have it queued up. But as you'll see in this video, when we visited in 2018, this was when the well, again, this was before it was a producing well, while it was still being drilled and fracked. We detected this really significant kind of cloud of emissions coming off of the well site. And it's a little hard to tell from the video, but it's technically coming from, in the picture you saw two kind of combustors visible over the sound wall that was around the site. This plume is coming from those combustors because they obviously were not properly combusting the gas that was coming off of the site while they were whatever stage of the pre-production they were in. So this was also another site that we filed a complaint on, and CDPHE investigated and found some definitely excess emissions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for the moment and open it up to the rest of the panelists, because I feel like I went really quickly through all of that. And I don't know if Andrew wants to lead up with just a next question, or if we want to open it up a bit.
Yeah, so I want to get into the next. Thank you for that. That last video is particularly shocking, and I think the video before that is going to be shocking to some people who have gotten well liquids unloading notices in their emails from their local governments in the last little while. I want to first ask Laurie to talk over what we see as some of the health impacts from these emissions, and then once we wrap up that question, have a little bit of discussion about what we've seen in the videos, what Elise has shared with us, and what Laurie is about to share with us. So Andrew, I think you have slides for Laurie as well. And with that, Laurie, we just saw some really troubling footage of emissions coming off of oil and gas facilities. I was wondering if you could talk for a moment about the health impacts that we typically see associated with such emissions.
Thank you, Andrew. And yes, those are some troubling emissions that we're seeing. I do want to talk about the health impacts, and some of what I was going to say was already discussed by Elise and probably Andrew, so I'll skip through some of my original points here. But one thing that's really important to note is that oil and gas development is constantly evolving. Different chemicals are being used, often proprietary. There's changing technology. Vertical wells are now being drilled horizontally and fracked, and ever increasing laterals, which concentrates this industrial activity at single well sites and prolongs that exposure of those operations to the most impacted nearby communities. And at the same time that the technology is moving forward, our data collection lags behind that development. What we have collected has indicated the need to increase regulations, which, as we all know, has been underway. So to get into these health impacts, the most at risk of experiencing health impacts due to increased pollution are young, our infants and our children. Our children's lungs continue to develop after birth, and children breathe faster than we do, and their organs do continue to develop after birth. Pregnant women, those with underlying health conditions, and the elderly are also at the higher risk. And risks include, and we'll get into these more on the next slide, negative effects on birth outcomes, asthma attacks, respiratory diseases, blood disorders, neurological disorders, cardiovascular impacts, cancer, and more. So these are to be taken very seriously. And this image on the top was actually taken, I had driven up to a little hill here in Broomfield and looked north. This was back at the end of March. This is not the summer ozone that we're so used to. And it was on March 30th, I believe it was actually on the 30th, that the Boulder Reservoir hit 100 parts per billion for ozone, and Broomfield lagged just behind at close to 100 parts per billion. So these are very serious concerns that we're facing. And the bottom image, in addition to, Andrew was showing you some of the non-visible emissions, this was a site in Broomfield with a tier 2 fracking fleet just behind the wall, and you can clearly see the NOx and particulate pollution just rising up from that site. And then there's also, in addition to that, is everything that you can't see. So next slide, please. I will hopefully go through these quickly, but just want to demonstrate, and this is not all of the pollutants, but I want to call it some of the major ones. And that some of these impacts are more immediate and others could go unnoticed for years, months or years, like the cancers. So VOCs, and Elise went over some of this already, that includes the BTEX, benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylene, and more. These are naturally occurring in oil and gas operations and lead to leukemia, asthma attacks, lung infections, low birth weight, headaches, vomiting, dizziness. Then we also have the NOx, which comes from the burning of the fossil fuels, whether they're the trucks that are and the equipment that are right on that oil and gas development side, or the vehicles that we drive down the road that are still fossil fuel burning. I know some of us have made the switch to electric cars, which is going to help in that area. But that the NOx, that leads to asthma attacks, chronically reduced lung function, headaches, eye irritation, and more. And then, like Lisa already described, when you take the NOx and you mix it with the VOCs and it's in the hot sun, we get the ground level ozone, which also leads to asthma attacks, lung infections, and impaired lung development. And then, add to that the methane, which is the main component of natural gas, which is a powerful greenhouse gas that contributes to climate change. And then we have all the health impacts related to climate change that are also coming from this development, along with other industries, and then the particulate matter, which is emitted from generators and trucks using oil and gas development and heavy traffic, and that can lead to infant death, asthma attacks, low birth weight, heart attack, stroke, cancer, premature death. And one thing that we're still learning more about, and that we need to continue to get more data on, is just what this cocktail of chemicals looks like. Like we have the state has collected some toxicology data, but they haven't collected toxicology data on all of the different chemicals. And they might set a limit saying that I think it's 10 parts per billion of benzene is the health guideline, and we need to stay below that. But they don't look at that compared to the health guideline that was set for toluene and ethylbenzene and every other chemical that's out there. So you're looking at them kind of standalone. And we need we're moving to that point where we need to look at all those chemicals together, and then also that exposure to those VOCs in combination with the NOx and the ozone and the particulate matter, and just start to look at this as a whole picture, because sometimes we want to collect that data, but we're not seeing the data is only as good as what you're collecting and what you're comparing it to, and we just have so much more that we need to learn here to start to understand, just what levels really are safe. But right now we know that we do have many health impacts, and these are concerning to us and to our future generations after us. And I think that was the last slide that oh no, there's one more slide. So next slide, please. And I just want to quickly show some Broomfield health data. And you can see there's some off on the left, there's the Livingston pad is shown in the middle, and then there's rings every 500 feet. And you can start to see clusters of dots just as you get to where the homes are, just a little over 1,000 feet away from the Livingston site. And what was surprising was that, what wasn't surprising is that we had reports of headaches, nosebleeds, eye irritation, difficulty breathing. Those are like the green dots and blue dots. But what was really surprising was the noise and just how impactful that noise was, and just how much more people could identify that the noise was absolutely coming off that pad, whereas not everybody identified a health concern with that operation. And the red was the highest number, several hundred complaints of noise, and it wasn't just the noise, it was the stress and the anxiety that went hand in hand with the inability to sleep at night because the noise was so loud. And I think that is everything that I had to share on the health impacts.
That's great, Laurie. I know you just summarized decades worth of data and impacts into about 5 minutes. So well done on getting through all that material. And Mike, you have been quiet for all of this, and I'm going to open this up for discussion now, but I want to ask whoever feels comfortable answering this. Laurie, you just showed a map that showed health impact or complaints really starting at 1,000 feet, and we've seen, I know we've all seen studies showing impacts at various distances, but could anybody on the panel offer their assessment of sort of the difference between acute and chronic impacts, and where we start seeing distances triggered, and like how acute versus chronic impacts the distance calculations? So that's kind of an odd question, but I'm envisioning people wondering about the difference between acquiring asthma over time versus having irritated eyes or, you know, headaches from acute emissions. So does anybody want to take a stab at that inarticulately asked question?
So Andrew, I can add just a little bit to what we saw here in Broomfield. And just to be clear that that map, no one lived closer than the 1/4 mile. So that's why the health impacts started there. And I'm sure that if somebody lived closer, they would have had something greater. But here's what's so hard about collecting this data, was that we have the Anthem Ranch residents. They're living just north of the Livingston site. And there's also a couple of residents over by the interchange pad that also noticed this, but they began to drop things more often. But then do you attribute that to, there's that potential component of like a neurological component to it. But at the same time, when residents are in a retirement community, they're getting older, it's like, well, am I just getting older? Is this just part of, you know, the aging process? And I know that was a discussion that went on. We did see a lot more eye irritation where multiple people's eyes were irritated on the same day, which kind of says there's something in the air. So I'll let others add on to that. But I think the one that's going to be the hardest for a lot of the residents here in my community, and I'm sure this is happening in many other communities, is the not knowing whether or not your child could get leukemia or cancer down the road. That is the not knowing is worse than the impacts that are that you know are happening and you can do something about. So I'll let others add on to that.
Yeah, Elise, Mike, Andrew.
Well, let me just echo the part about not knowing. Is a lot of sort of chronic studies about, gee, if you lived next to this stuff for 20 years, are you going to get cancer? We don't have the full answers. We have a lot of studies that flag problems, but determining, you know, with, you know, complete certainty such that you can litigate around that is much more difficult. And that's why, and we haven't really moved into local regulations or state regulations yet, but we will. And that proximity is one of the issues that you see reflected in regulations and setbacks, so that you don't have, you're not close to this stuff. The farther away, then you can address both the acute and the chronic more safely. And that's why setbacks tend to be sort of the bread and butter of a lot of the regulations that give our constituents comfort, and should follow some of the precautionary principle in making sure that we're creating some safety for the answers, for the questions that are unanswered.
And I actually think, so rather than us trying to answer this question, I think, Elise, you pointed out that this is a really good transition into the next set of questions, which is, what are we doing about all this? Like, we're seeing bucket loads of emissions, like literally like clouds of smoke blowing off pads, and in the work that Andrew does with Earthworks, seeing, you know, invisible emissions streaming across neighborhoods and fields and all sorts of stuff. It's a real problem. And there's a lot of different tools that we have at our disposal to address it. And all of this sort of exists within the American framework of government, which has a federal government, a state government, and various local governments with delegated authority. So I think it makes sense to start at the top from the state perspective, which is the state legislature in this case. And so with that, I want to give Mike Foote a chance to talk about what the state is doing it through the legislature. And actually, sorry, Mike, before you start talking, for the panelists that are on right now, we're getting a bunch of questions in the Q&A section that I think can be answered with simple, like just text answers. Like some are, you know, about like how many monitors we have and stuff like that. So if you feel comfortable engaging in the Q&A section while other panelists are speaking, feel free to like drop in that Q&A and see if there's any questions you feel comfortable answering. Otherwise, we'll try and get to them at the end. But sorry for that interruption. Mike, if you could talk about some of the legislative work that we've been undertaking to get at this issue.
Yeah, it's all good. Thanks, Andrew. And I guess, of course, I'll talk about this from a happily retired legislator position. Although what I'd like to do, I think, is talk a little bit about some of the changes brought about by Senate Bill 181, which makes sense because I'm the Senate Bill 181 guy on this call. And I'll talk a little bit about that with the relation to COGCC, the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. Just touch about the Air Quality Control Commission, because of course Elise is on that and she'll be able to add more if that's appropriate. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the pending legislation, at least a couple bills that I see that have potential to make a big difference. Of course, we don't really know if they're going to pass or what form they're going to pass in, but just a flag for everybody here on this call to keep an eye out for. So, you know, I think, well, first of all, I don't have any slides. I hope you guys don't mind that. I think it's going to make me a little bit less august to not have any slides in this presentation. But you know, I could put text on a slide. I don't really know if that's going to really matter that much. I don't have any good graphs. But, you know, with Senate Bill 181 that was passed back in 2019, it made some really big changes to oil and gas regulation. I think probably everybody on this call knows that. Two of the main changes that it made were to local government authority as well as the COGCC's mission. You know, prior to Senate Bill 181, huge issues were there, especially with the fact that local governments were trying to respond to what their residents were complaining about and trying to respond to neighborhood drilling and some of the abuses that were occurring at the state level. And they were getting sued because of the state preemption doctrine. And so Senate Bill 181 sought to really address that by giving local governments more explicit authority to deal with, in particular, surface impacts of oil and gas development. And then the other main thing is the COGCC's authority and not really their authority, but really their mission to carry out their authority. Beforehand, it was about promoting oil and gas development. And also, they were supposed to take into consideration making sure it was consistent with public health, safety, and welfare. But really what that meant, practically speaking, was that oil and gas development was prioritized and public health and safety was not. So we flipped that around and made it into a regulatory agency where it prioritized public health, safety, and welfare. Now, in this and other things that I'll talk about, many of those things have yet to be fleshed out, exactly what that turns out to be. It's being defined, and eventually there will be some test permits that come through, I'm assuming. But it's still a little bit too early to tell, even though this has been in effect for 2 years. It's still a little bit too early to tell exactly how it's going to turn out, this mission change with the COGCC. But I think, again, going back to a risk of stating the obvious, I think most people know that there was a big rulemaking last year that was the quote unquote mission change rulemaking that dealt with the COGCC's mission. And as it really relates specifically to oil and gas emissions, which is really what we're talking about here, one of the things I wanted to flag for everybody is that rule, or those rules in the mission change, did get rid of routine venting and flaring that was happening in some areas, not everywhere in Colorado, but there were some operators that were just flaring and venting routine routinely because they wanted the oil and the gas was kind of not important to them, which of course made a big impact on air quality around those areas. So one of the rules that was changed was to limit it much more, get rid of routine venting and flaring. It doesn't mean it never happens. There are situations where it's allowed to happen, including emergencies and for safety reasons, but it's been reduced quite a bit because of the emission change rulemaking that occurred last year. Another thing I want to point out that made a big difference in the emission change rulemaking, and this came from CDPHE, was a modeling study that was done that modeled types of acute symptoms that are modeled to occur at the 2,000-foot limit. Things like headaches, things like nosebleeds, those were modeled in this study. And it was shown that under certain circumstances, at least under this model, those things could happen, which does not come as a surprise to, I think, many of the folks on this call, particularly those from Broomfield, because as the council member just mentioned, that's what they were complaining about. And during the emission change rulemaking, the commissioners were very impacted by the fact that this modeling study showed that there could be these acute symptoms at 2,000 feet. And in fact, that's what people were complaining about at 2,000 feet, even more about these types of symptoms. So it wasn't just a study that didn't have any backup. It was a study that had real world backup and real world examples of how it was playing out. So that played, I think, a big role in the 2,000-foot setback with exceptions that the COGCC put in during the emission change. Another thing that was in the bill was a requirement that cumulative impacts have to be considered when making decisions about oil and gas permitting. Cumulative impacts has not been something that's been considered before, but it's not unique to Colorado. In fact, the federal government has been doing it for quite some time under the National Environmental Protection Act. It's a big process, but there's all kinds of case law and authority about how it's being done at the federal level. But, frankly, in 181, we didn't really define what should be done with this cumulative impact information. And really, that's because we didn't really quite know. And it turns out that those that are trying to carry out the cumulative impact analysis don't really quite know yet either. The COGCC in their emission change rulemaking has required reporting of the various types of impacts that are expected. That's going to go into a big database for further analysis and I think a further rulemaking down the road. But what to do about this, and I guess in plain English, trying to figure out when enough is enough is something that still has yet to be defined, both at the state level and the local level, because there's some local governments that are working with this now too, based on their new authority under 181. So that's just an issue that that's still out there, and it's going to be super important, I think. I mean, if you have a place that has a lot of drilling, or even not a lot of drilling, but drilling with a lot of impacts in a small amount of area, cumulative impacts plays a huge role, particularly with air quality, but other things too. But air quality is an area where it makes a big difference. So I'll move on and talk a little bit about the AQCC in relation to Senate Bill 181, which said that the Air Quality Control Commission must, quote, minimize emissions of harmful pollutants. Senate Bill 181 did not curb in any way the local authority to go above and beyond the state and federal air quality standards. So we have the federal level, like the Clean Air Act, we have the federal level of standards, then you have the state level, and the state can go above and beyond the federal level. And local governments can also go above and beyond the state level if they choose to do so. Now, that doesn't mean that it's unlimited what local governments can do. They can't just put in a regulation because they want to. They have to justify it. I think it still would be subject to an arbitrary and capricious type of review by courts if there was an appeal. But it does allow local governments, just as it has been for quite some time, local governments can go above and beyond the state governments if they choose to do so. One thing that's come up recently that's a difference between the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission and the Air Quality Control Commission is that Senate Bill 181 it did have that passage about the AQCC where there's supposed to be minimization of emissions. It dealt mostly with COGCC though, and it took out one of the considerations from COGCC deliberations of economic feasibility and technical feasibility in their decision making. And this was something that the industry was using quite a bit over the last many years to argue against proposed regulations that would increase health and safety. So we took it out of the consideration in the COGCC. However, we did not take it out of the consideration from the AQCC. So that means that in deliberations for the AQCC, you're still going to hear a lot of discussion about economic reasonableness and technical feasibility. Those are still things that the AQCC has to deal with when they're promulgating rules that deal with air quality, with everything that they deal with, including oil and gas. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of those bills that I mentioned, or I referenced at the beginning with the legislature. I'll start off and just lay the foundation a little bit with a bill that you're also probably familiar with, which was also in 2019, House Bill 1261, which set emissions reductions in state law. The reductions under 1261 require a 25% GHG reduction by 2025, which is not very far down the road. 50% reduction by 2030 and a 90% reduction by 2050, and that's using 2005 levels. So what we've seen since 1261 has gone into place is that we're not getting there quick enough. We've got 4 years before this first landmark, and I think most environmental groups in particular think that we're not getting there quick enough. There might be some dispute about that from the state government at this point, but certainly there's at the very least concern we're not going to get there. So there's another bill that's pending this year. It's Senate Bill 200 that is known, I think, a little bit more informally as 1261 with teeth. So it's designed as it's currently written to make sure that we do get to those levels, or maybe increase action to make sure we get to those levels of which we're supposed to anyway by 2025. So it requires things, as currently written, it requires things like rural electrics and municipal electrics to submit plans for big cuts to GHG emissions by 2030. It would allow the Air Quality Control Commission to charge fees for emissions. My personal favorite is that it would require the AQCC to consider the social cost of GHG emissions, which, in my opinion, I think is one of the keys to really neutralizing the economics argument, putting a number on GHG emissions and being able to balance that with the economic argument put forth by industries. So that's still pending. And, it's hard to know exactly what form it's going to come out, ultimately, assuming that it passes, but keep an eye on that bill. It should be an important bill. And then the other one that I'll talk about very briefly is House Bill 1189, which I guess some people know it as the Suncor bill. It deals with, or it would deal with if passed, much more monitoring for the biggest facilities, the biggest emitters around the state, and also an ability for the Air Quality Control Commission to list more than the chemicals they currently can list as air toxics, which of course would allow them to regulate those chemicals much higher than they do now, a much higher level of regulation. So I'll just conclude by saying this. I hope this was helpful. There's lots going on. There has been lots going on over the last couple of years, particularly since the 2019 legislative session started, which is great, but a lot more needs to be done. I mean, that's my opinion, but I think that there still needs to be many more steps to be done. There's, for example, a really big rulemaking coming up at the end of the year with the AQCC about oil and gas emissions. And I think the intent is to try to actually reduce emissions instead of just making sure they don't increase as fast. And so that's happening. That's going to be a big deal. But I think in all of these things that are happening, it's important to make sure, and I think most of the people on this call probably already do this, it's important to make sure that the community stays involved. The community groups and environmental groups are heavily involved in the process because, the industry groups and the polluters are there and they're involved, and they have a big investment in people to be involved in these things. And it's important for the communities to be heard and be involved to the extent that they possibly can. What I've seen with COGCC is They've certainly changed in the way they go about doing business when it comes to hearing the public and considering the input of the public, which, frankly, was not a high bar before 181, but they've made I think they've made a big change in how they take the public's input seriously now. And that's a good thing. So you just have to make sure that you're there and can take advantage of that new outlook that our relatively new commissioners have. So I will leave it at that, and certainly look forward to trying to answer all the questions that I see in my peripheral vision popping up when I'm talking, and I'll see if I can kind of go through those and try to answer some of them here in a couple minutes.
Great, Mike. That's great. I especially love your thoughts on something that Elise weighed in on a little bit from Boulder County's perspective, which was the legal recourse that local governments have about emissions outside of their jurisdictions. I'll let you pontificate in the chat about that while we let Elise talk a little bit about some of the work that AQCC has been doing in the last couple of years.
Sure. And thanks so much for that, Mike. You laid it out really well. The Air Quality Control Commission has general authority over protecting Colorado's air, but the passage of Senate Bill 181 on oil and gas gave us more authority and direction. It said, this commission, you will do these things. And then the House Bill 1261 that set climate targets, same thing. So I've only been on the commission since 2019, and it was billed as one day a month meeting, couple of rulemakings a year, no big whoop. And when we got these legislative directives, it is 2 days a month and rulemakings every few months, pedal to the metal, which is great. And we still have so much more to do. Mike's entirely correct. I have a few slides, but I feel like I should go through them pretty quickly. So if you want to flash the first one up, the commission's done over a dozen rulemakings since 2005 specific to oil and gas, and still has a lot more to do. Since the passage of Senate Bill 181 and 1261, they've come fast and furious. 2019 was a really big one. There was a lot that was done in that. Some of the highlights was the closure of the 90-day permitting loophole for new oil and gas facilities was closed. For larger well production facilities that emitted greater than 2 tons per year have to greatly increase from what it was, leak detection and repair activities. So the bigger the facility and the closer a facility is to homes, the more they have to check for leaks and repair them. More reporting requirements, more controls for storage tanks, which are a huge emitter, expansion of some of the pneumatic controller mission controls. These are devices across oil and gas sites were expanded from the non-attainment area statewide. So a big rulemaking that really was inspired by 181. Next slide. And then 2 more in 2020, requiring more high frequency monitoring at new wells pre-production, which is when a lot of these emissions that Laurie was talking about happen before, when there's drilling and fracking going on, really doing monitoring then, requiring more controls then, and regulating things like the large engines that happen at those sites. Also in 2020, hats off to Logic and some of the other community groups negotiating a compromise with industry that requires more leak detection and repair activities at sites near homes. Again, we got to protect our public health, and that's one way we can do it. And then just more recently, pneumatic controllers, another huge source of leaks at oil and gas sites, tightening down those. Colorado became the first state in the nation to require retrofits of pneumatic controls at existing sites. So we're making progress in Colorado. We have a whole lot more to do, but there's a reason that people look to Colorado for some of these regulations, and that's because advocates like you require the commission and the legislature to take action. Last slide. And this highlights what the point that Mike mentioned is the work that's yet to happen is super important. The roadmap on climate requires significant reductions from the oil and gas sector, 33% by 2025, 50% reduction in emissions by 2030. And the rulemaking to really catalyze that is going to happen this December. The stakeholder process is underway. The formal rulemaking process will be between September and December. So there's an opportunity for people to weigh in with their public comments and be a part of groups that can be parties to really make sure that this rulemaking serves as setting a cap on the industry to force emissions to go lower in a really significant way. So I can't underscore how important this one is for your participation. I think I'll stop there. If we have more time, we can talk about the fact that the state's doing more with research and monitoring than it was before, thanks to some new funds, but that's enough for me for now.
Thanks, Elise. I have follow-up questions for 2 points that were raised here. And since I wrote the first one down and can remember it more easily, I'll do the second one first, which is, Elise, there was a question, is either a Q&A question or a chat question that I think touched on one of these rulemakings that you mentioned, which was the increased monitoring rulemaking from 2020. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, maybe you or Laurie, I think you were involved in this quite a bit too, about how frequently monitoring is required to happen, the proximity triggers and stuff like that, so we can get a sense of like how frequently actual like inspectors are looking at this stuff versus when Andrew and his colleagues are collecting data on their own as private individuals, or when it's operators doing imaging themselves or inspections themselves.
Laurie, did you want to jump in or?
Oh, you can go ahead at the state level and I will.
Okay. Well, I will say that was the September 2020 rulemaking, and part of one of the directives in Senate Bill 181 was we have to do continuous monitoring, and that rulemaking falls short of continuous monitoring, because I think advocates think, hey, it's all the way, fence line monitoring all the way around a facility 24/7, and that is not that. And we weren't able to get that far. What it is, there is, for better or worse, there's a lot of debate over what's the best way to monitor, what are the best technologies and tools and frequency. So the program was set up, some commission members like me wanted to strengthen it, but what we ended up with was, it was almost more like R&D, that companies could actually propose a monitoring scheme using different technologies at different frequencies. We requested it to be high frequency, but that's short of continuous monitoring. So this is a place where active engagement is needed, because we're not where we need to be. And there's some legitimacy around testing some of the technologies, but by and large, we just need to keep pushing. And as the data from these initial sort of piloting monitoring comes in, we have to use that to really increase the bar to get to the continuous monitoring threshold that the legislature directed, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, it was an interesting overlap between the sort of financial economic feasibility part of continuous monitoring versus the mandate to do continuous air quality monitoring. So there's sort of cross legislative requirements that I recall being a major topic of discussion. Laurie, I'd love to hear, so this is going to get into a little bit more of the next round of questions, but I think, Laurie, this would be a good primer about what Broomfield's been doing in this space regarding frequency of inspections and stuff like that. Also, before Laurie, you start, I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm 30 minutes past the timeline I normally feed my dogs at, so they're going to be starting to make an appearance asking for dinner. So I apologize if you hear and see them in the background.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I actually have a slide coming up where we're going to dive deeper into the monitoring that's going on in Broomfield and other locations. So we might want to save that for later, but I'll just echo Elise that we had high hopes for the state, that the state would actually be doing the monitoring that we so desperately needed. But instead, we will continue, Broomfield will and other communities will continue to monitor locally at the level that we believe is necessary, which is quite costly. Broomfield spending, it was over $1 million last year. It's close to $1 million this year to get the level of monitoring that we believe is necessary. At these sites, and with this still with limitations on what that technology can can provide us. So I can leave it there because we'll be coming back around to air quality monitoring here shortly, if that's good.
Begging forgiveness for the mute button again. I forgot that I was on mute. So I think that's a great transition into the sort of third round of questions and what I think is really the meat of this discussion, which is why I'm glad we have almost an hour left on the clock for it. The reason we're here basically is because the Larimer Alliance in Larimer County is currently revising its regulations, as are many local governments. And all these various legislative processes and agency processes are creating a framework of state rules and regulations. They're also granting authority to local governments to act in the same space. And as local governments start to sort of grapple with the authority that they've been giving, there's a lot of sort of differences in opinion on the extent to which local governments can act in certain spaces. So that's why I'm really glad to have Mike Foote on for this particular bit of discussion. I'd love to start with a discussion about what authority you view local governments to have, particularly related to air quality, both monitoring and emissions regulations spaces. I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, I'm assuming that we'll have some good discussions about this too with some questions. You know, particularly related to air emissions, I think I might have jumped the gun a little bit and talked about that a little bit in my last presentation, which is that, you know, it has been the case for quite some time that the Clean Air Act is what the federal government adheres to, but it also allows the state to go above and beyond the Clean Air Act, and the state Clean Air Act allows the local governments to go above and beyond what the state government does. But before you get all giddy about that, you have to realize that there's limitations to it as well. I mean, local governments can't just come up with a regulation just because they want to, they think it sounds good. If you have a local government that would be inclined to say no drilling whatsoever, or no conditions allowed, you have to be able to justify that. You can't just say it. And so that applies here as well. And it applies to other regulations too. In particular, any other kind of surface area regulation is subject to the necessary and reasonable standard, which has yet to be fleshed out in court, what exactly that means. But what I typically encourage local government officials to do is make sure that there's justification in the record that can really help justify the rules that they've ended up settling on. And some local governments are putting it down as well within the actual regulations. I'm thinking about Broomfield in particular. I think Boulder County does it as well, just talking about some of the justifications for these more protective rules, pointing towards the studies and the data that's out there that would justify the more protective rules. And so, short of any kind of specifics and comparisons, which I understand may be coming up, and I don't want to take any of the air out of the room for that, but short of that, I would just say, to the extent that you're doing your advocacy and talking to local government officials and the state as well, make sure that they, number one, have plenty of justification, which they should be able to, for stricter regulations, for bigger protections. And number two, make sure that it's clear that those are being relied upon, or at least are being listened to when the local government's coming to their conclusion. And the one final thing I'll mention that we need to make sure local governments and the state also are considering is that there needs to be, in my opinion, a real, well, what's the word I'm looking for? There needs to be an acknowledgement that one of the outcomes of a permit process would be the denial of a permit. You know, I think sometimes what the local governments, some are talking about, not all, but what some are talking about is, well, 181 kind of changed the conditions by which they can drill, so it's more protective. But 181 also the intent was to make sure that local governments have the authority, as the COGCC should have the authority, to say no to some permits. If they're not going to be protective of public health, safety, and welfare, the answer can be no. Of course, there has to be justification. They can't say no just because they don't like it. But what I think we see from some local governments, particularly from maybe their staff, which is used to working in a pre-181 world, is that they're not necessarily going there. So, just keep that in mind. Make sure that it's stated specifically and it's mentioned, as it is actually within the COGCC regs after the mission change rulemaking, that one of the answers can be no. It's not about the conditions necessarily. It's about the fact that it may not happen because it's just not going to be safe in the way they propose it.
Yeah, so that's a great point, Mike. And I think this is something that Elise and Laurie and yourself are all qualified to answer. And Andrew, I know we've got some stuff coming up for you later, so don't feel too left out here. But I love the perspective from both the current and recovering elected officials on the panel about what sort of justification you feel is sort of adequate to take such action as denial, how you feel, and please don't talk specifics about specific permits because I don't want anybody to get into any trouble about current or pending activities. Laurie, that's, I think, specifically for you, given that you're the only one that's currently making adjudicative decisions. But I'd love to hear what you think is an adequate sort of framework for denial criteria. One thing that was mentioned in the chat is like history of violations from operators, or their inability to demonstrate that they can operate safely, versus sort of like conditions on the ground and potential emissions and stuff like that. So maybe Laurie first, then Elise, and then Mike, if you have any thoughts that they haven't mentioned.
Thank you, Andrew. And I actually had a slide prepared for this. I'm not sure if I'm actually going to stick to the slide following what Mike has just shared, but I don't know if we want to put that one up or not. It's kind of optional. I will state that when we're looking at our local regulations, that some of the justifications that we have, so I'm not going to follow the slide exactly, but some of the justifications that we have used are, like Mike noted, the CDPHE 2,000 foot setbacks, that study, and our own local health data that we had looked at the one slide from earlier. There's much more data than that, showing the impacts that our residents did experience, because we don't have those health guidelines that state, if you measure emission of this level, then these are the health impacts you're going to see. That it just simply doesn't exist when you start to look at this combination of all the different emission sources. And then we also have some very specific examples that have occurred in Broomfield. And these are actually my first couple of points on the slide. I want to just talk really briefly about this plug and abandoned well failure, the Davis 43-6 well in Broomfield, and also a very specific example of a shut-in well that has been problematic in Broomfield. And two things I don't want to forget as I'm moving into that space is that Broomfield passed, and I just recalled this now, which is like should be always on top of my mind. We passed Proposition 301 back in 2017. The voters approved that. They know it has no adverse impacts from oil and gas language in it. And then we also have the reasonable and necessary standard that was put in place at the state level. And so the combination of those two is kind of forms the basis for that potential denial of future permits for oil and gas, for new oil and gas development. But beyond, so we're looking forward at the future landscape of what would be permitted in Broomfield. It has a much higher bar than the past. So and we're looking at the oil and gas development, the emissions specifically, we have to deal with some of this past infrastructure that does already exist. So moving back to that Davis 43-6 well, I'm sure that many of you have heard about this orphaned plugged and abandoned well in Broomfield that lies in the middle, just a few lots away from homes that are under construction and residents have moved into. And Broomfield, a couple of years ago, established a soil gas testing program based upon resident concerns about these existing plug and abandoned wells, and sampling at that location, as many other locations tested fine, but sampling at the Davis 43-6 well indicated that there's methane, subsurface methane in the soil. And the COGCC ultimately did dig up Grams Peak Way. They dug down. They did determine that it was the Davis 43-6 well. They took it into their orphaned well program and repaired it. And then they did some testing nearby and put some, they call them test wells, but they're actually more like vents, just PVC vents down into the ground, and found explosive levels of methane surrounding that well site. And the cap, it dissipates over time, but when they cap it, it builds back up again. So they actually drilled out further recently and put some new vents in and found methane up to 120 feet away. So one of the requests that we had as we're writing our new regulations was to look to, and we're also considering reverse setback. So this piece actually goes beyond, this is as looking towards future development. We actually asked for the COGCC's data and learned that they do collect data. It's not searchable. Like we can't easily get a compilation of what they've seen. So we are left to base our decisions on our existing data that we've collected here in Broomfield. We've seen an example that wasn't that warrants a further setback to new home development. And the current builder in the area is working with the COGCC right now on trenching to try to dissipate that subsurface methane so their building permits can go forward. So we learned a lesson on that one about what future development looks like near wells and the need to be doing the soil gas testing, which I would recommend for any community, especially where you have people living near these plugged and abandoned wells. So it's a component that should definitely be considered in any new regulations. Then we also have a well that we call the Carlson 124 that's located 250 feet from Aspen Creek Elementary School. And this well, a couple of years back, failed a mechanical integrity test. It's a shut-in well. They did repair it, but it just remains shut in. It's holding a spacing unit for a boundary well. That situation has kind of put it on our radar that we need to look at these plugged and abandoned, the shut-in wells and the low producing wells. Some people call them stripper wells. I guess that's a tax status. But we do need to look at all those existing wells that is a major source of emissions and cleaning up that existing infrastructure. And I don't have all the answers, but that's something that we really need to be thinking about. It's not just the new permits, but it's going back and cleaning up what's existing and reducing those emissions. And also beyond that, we're also relying on I think I already stated that one, that we're looking at our own health concern reporting data and Broomfield's air quality monitoring, which we'll get into shortly. We are collecting some good data here in Broomfield. We also have our noise monitoring data, which I think every community needs to be, I know we're not talking about noise here, but that's absolutely something that communities need to be looking at, is the noise that comes with these operations. And I think that's really it. I've already talked about our plans for all of the as we're looking forward to large scale operations, but also the existing infrastructure. Oh, and I will add, I think this was actually one of the questions in the chat about development that occurs with operators who have, start to have a history of repeated problems. And I know Boulder included the operator registration, and Broomfield is including the operator registration piece and looking at past performance of the operator, and then just those ongoing inspections. And the one key piece that I think we all are aware of so often is that enforcement needs to result in corrective action and not just more fines being paid. We actually need to get those leaks repaired and anything else that we find that's wrong with a well. And that is pretty much what I have on local government regulations. So
you're really stepping on the toes of my outline there, Laurie. So Elise, I know I had asked you to weigh in on this too, but I want to get Andrew Klooster's thoughts on the emissions from plugged and abandoned and shut-in infrastructure. Elise, before we get into your thoughts on the sort of dispositive nature of that, Andrew, the footage that you showed us earlier was from producing wells or marginally produced wells and wells that are in production. What have you guys seen from shut-in, temporarily abandoned, not producing, inactive facilities?
We have seen, we have detected emissions at, as I mentioned, at inactive sites or sites that are listed as shut-in or temporarily abandoned. And you know, one thing that we have sort of tracked and noted is that, you know, despite potentially finding emissions at these sites or you know, seeing other issues with the site, these, you know, if we do file a complaint and there is an investigation, typically that site status doesn't really change. I mean, it continues to just, that can continues to be kicked down the road. So even if an inactive well is found to be emitting and there may be an investigation a year later, 2 years later, it still is listed as an inactive well and it still may be possibly emitting. I mean, one of the things that's concerning about these sites is, given that they're inactive or temporarily abandoned, they're maybe not being monitored as closely or, you know, frequently as a site that is active, or where at least you're going to have operators on site relatively frequently. So if there are problems or malfunctions or whatever, which do occur, they occur on active sites that aren't always caught. So we have to assume that they're also occurring on these inactive sites. They're not going to be caught as quickly. And sometimes it will take someone like us, you know, randomly pointing an OGI camera at it to detect this emission. And who knows how long that leak or that malfunction may have been emitting at that point, given that these sites are just sitting inactive and not being as frequently inspected. So it is a problem. I mean, we've never done a concerted effort to just look at inactive wells, but from those that we have looked at, we have detected emissions.
That's a really great point. And I think somebody asked in the Q&A whether or not anybody's doing a sort of cumulative study or review of the toxic emissions from non-producing sites. To my knowledge, the answer is kind of yes and kind of no. And also apologies, my wife just got home, so my dogs are going to bark, so I'm going to close my door. Sorry about that. Second spouse sighting of the day. Sorry about that. I think these studies are in progress. I don't know if anybody has done it in Colorado, but I think this financial assurance rulemaking at the state is starting to turn up some interesting work from other jurisdictions with lots of oil and gas development. So the answer to that question is kind of. And I think they're only going to become more prevalent as we go forward. So Elise, I'd like to get back to your thoughts on that sort of local authority and violations issue, especially that operator registration piece that Laurie mentioned.
Sure. Well, I will say, I'll just put in a plug. I'm holding up Boulder County's revised regulations. It's one of the last things I did as a commissioner back in December. We think they're the strongest regulations in the state, and we encourage other local governments to take a look. We have really good attorneys that put together justifications and think they're legally defensible. Of course, they haven't been put to use because nobody's tried to drill a new well in Boulder County in terms of submitting a permit since, well, before I was commissioner, so over 8 years. And I will say we go so far as to direct that the Board of County Commissioners will deny any permit if the proposed oil and gas facility cannot be conducted in a manner that protects public health, safety, and welfare of the environment and the wildlife. So we require the commission to deny. And we put the burden of proof on the operator to meet 30 different conditions of approval, everything from, you know, air to runoff to wildlife to site management to emergency response. We also, to address the issue about existing facilities, we actually require monthly inspections of existing facilities and basically up the ante that if I think operators will have to think twice whether or not they want to have old wells continuing to operate, because we require significant investment in making sure that they're not leaking and requiring annual soil sampling and that kind of thing as well, to try to get companies to go ahead and reclaim old wells, because in our past we have our own inspector, and we find that those sites leak quite a bit. And yes, we have a operator registration and renewal section that requires them to go into detail about their past history around spills, releases, accidents, injuries, their response, and also their financial sustainability. So basically to prove that they are able to actually operate safely. So again, I would encourage people that Senate Bill 181, thank you, Mike Foote, was written to give local governments a whole heck of a lot of authority that they haven't been using yet. And it's quite frankly time to use it. And I think you should look at Broomfield's regs. You should look at Boulder County's regs to get hints on how you can take advantage of all the authority that's been offered.
Thanks, Elise. And somebody in the chat was asking for a link to the Boulder County oil and gas regs. And I wonder if I can call on Ed or Sarah, who are our chat gurus right now, to find those links for folks. Oh, Tim's on it. Thanks, Tim. Pulling double duty as a panelist and a Google czar. Mike, did you have anything to add to that discussion on sort of like denial criteria and what sort of fits in there? I know you were engaging in the chat as well, but wanted to give you a chance to speak to any issues that you have.
I don't think so, other than just to kind of, I mean, like I said, I look also to the Broomfield and Boulder regs about that particular issue, and it's specific, and it of course vests a lot of appropriate discretion in the commissioners or the city council members, whatever the case may be, to make that decision. To the extent it can be backed up by data, I think is helpful. Broomfield has, of course, done a really good job of trying to collect that. It's because of the unfortunate reality that it's there and it's causing a lot of problems. But to the extent it can be backed up by data, I think the courts will defer to the local elected officials as long as they can justify it in some way. So what the courts probably wouldn't defer to would be just some kind of a decision that's not backed up by anything. But as long as it's backed up by something, particularly data, you're probably going to be on a little more safer ground.
Yeah, I think that's a point we can't make enough, and that's that local governments have pretty broad authority, but it needs to be supportive. They can't just willy-nilly make a decision. So part of our job as engaged residents is to provide some of that support to local governments. So we have some elected officials on the call. So I'm sure you can nod along to the value of contributions from the public and citing studies and providing references for local electeds when they're making these rules. And I think, Laurie, you answered most of my next question, which was how local governments are best suited to fill the gaps at the state. I think that's what you had those slides up for. So I wonder if you want to just spend 30 seconds reframing some of that answer into like the gap filling role that local governments can play.
Sure, I think I did answer your next question. So I think one of the things that it's going in and determining every step of the process, the existing development, the new development, looking at the air quality, specifically what we're doing here tonight. And I think in addition to what I stated earlier, one of the important points that Elise made was that when we're looking at this existing infrastructure, and when you actually go in and start to inspect it and start to find those leaks and the things that need to be repaired, that does incentivize them to move forward, the operators to move forward with the actual plug and abandonment step. And then going one step further, something that I was, recently brought to my attention was that when a well is still shut in or low producing, from many, many years ago, there is still oversight on it. Once that well is plugged and abandoned, we need to make sure that we're continuing that oversight. And that's where Broomfield has the annual soil gas testing program. So just as you're moving forward, that we have the current, looking forward to large scale new development, we've got all the existing development, but don't forget that important last phase that goes into perpetuity. Those wells do not go away. They remain there forever, and they do need to be inspected on an annual basis. And hopefully that's a recap.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And paying some attention to plugged and abandoned infrastructure is really important. We're learning more and more about that as we go through the financial assurance rulemaking at the COGCC level. When is a well done, and when do we have to stop worrying about it? And it seems like the unfortunate answer might be never, which is really troubling, but something that the COGCC is poised to address in this financial assurance rulemaking. So I don't know if we want to get too much into that now, but I think in the interest of focusing on the Larimer County situation that we have in front of us, and given the fact that they are currently revising their regulations, and we have some people who have been involved in a lot of different regulatory adventures over the last couple of years, I'm wondering if we can highlight some successes and some good regulatory examples from our various local governments that have started to grapple with this issue. Laurie, I know you have some thoughts on this. Andrew, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as a non-elected, what you see as some great successes. And Mike and Elise, feel free to jump in too, and then we'll get into the Q&A. So Laurie, I think you had a slide for this.
Oh, Andrew, I have a slide for the air quality monitoring. Do we
Okay.
want to do both together, or do you want to do the successes of the regulations followed by the air quality monitoring?
Well, I think the air quality monitoring is a part of the success of regulation, right?
Yes, that is the success of data collection in the, okay, so sure, yeah, go to the next slide.
Let's
then
go
I'll
pull that one up.
here.
Mr. Klooster, if you could.
Okay, so here, I'm gonna just quickly kind of breeze over air quality monitoring. This could be an entire presentation in itself on its own. So this is gonna be very high level. Just wanna note that Broomfield, it has a very extensive air quality monitoring program following on the heels of one that was established in Boulder a few years back, and also Longmont has also implemented a very good air quality monitoring program. So there's some pretty good examples to look at now. And air quality monitoring is only as good as the design of the system, and they are not all created equal. And as we know, what the state put in place and what the local governments believe is necessary are two different things. And thankfully, we have that right to go further. And Broomfield actually put this air quality monitoring in place in response to an 84 well plan that is underway in Broomfield. And the operator provided $20,000 a year. And as we went and looked at into quality air quality monitoring, collecting the data we needed, we found out $20,000 a year does not cover anywhere near a decent system. You can't even get a single little monitoring site for that. And as we're beginning to collect this data, we also have to keep in mind, and I've been told not to fear the data, because as we start to see the data come in, and it has uncovered some things here in Broomfield, and I wish some of our scientists were on the line, I'm sure you've heard from them before, as they pinpointed certain emissions back to very specific areas. But as we collect the data, we also, that one piece that is lagging even further behind is the understanding, which I touched on a little bit earlier, was the toxicology data and understanding. We don't have that for all the chemicals that are coming off of these sites. And we also don't understand, as those different chemicals are mixed together, and what we're calling that cocktail of chemicals, we don't understand how they all interact and what that cumulative effect of those is, and also in relation to the ozone and particulate matter and other things that are simultaneously occurring. So getting back to the basis of like, what does an air quality monitor really entail, and how did Broomfield get to the one that we chose? One thing that I think we all agree on is that you need to be monitoring 24/7, because you can't just monitor specific days and think all is well, because things change over time. So that continuous monitoring and making sure that that data is available near real time to the public. And talk about a couple nuances here, because there's SUMA canisters, which provide very good data, but they're not immediately available. And when residents get results back a couple weeks later that they were exposed to something, it's not as beneficial as being immediately notified. But you'll see two systems here. The one on the left is the Boulder air stations. We actually have, this is the main trailer that's pictured, and there's a satellite trailer that's located on the other side of the Livingston site. And then on the right, you'll see a picture of a APIS monitor, and they have added triggered canisters to those monitors. And I want to kind of describe the difference between these two. That they both are continuous, but the data is significantly different. The two Boulder air trailers, they provide what we refer to as reference grade data that would actually be usable in a court system. And that was one of the things that was very important to Broomfield, was having that high quality data. And also measuring many different chemicals. The station has a gas chromatography, which measures many of the different BTEX compounds and other VOCs. It also measures ozone, particulate matter, H2S, I'm going to forget something, there's NOx, and a couple more things that it measures. And it's just like a really good, robust set of data. Now, the limitation here is that these trailers, due to their cost, we can't put these all over Broomfield. So we actually have those in conjunction with those APA sensors that are on the right that are located in multiple locations and can be multiple locations around a pad as well. But those data, those points, they cover a better spatial area, but their sensors only measure TVOCs, which is total VOCs, and it's just a relative number to the numbers collected before it. But we did have an addition to make this data much more valuable was when that TVOC signal goes up significantly, it draws a SUMA canister sample, which is then analyzed in the lab, and then we can see really what happened in those moments. So that provides us another piece. And what I've noticed over time is that Dr. Helmig and Dr. Helmig with Boulder Air and Dr. Collette with CSU, you know, they're measuring different data, but a lot of times that data can be used together to really help us understand what's happening. So now we know better what is happening from the time all this equipment was put in place. The trigger canisters were more recent, and the Boulder Air trailers, we only got those put up because this stuff takes time to develop. We only caught the tail end of flowback on the Livingston site, and we haven't captured like the drilling and the fracking and the coiling and tubing operations. So we will start to see more and more as time goes by, and definitely encourage communities to get this monitoring, start planning ahead, because this doesn't happen overnight. And hopefully that's helpful on the air quality monitoring side. So.
Yeah, and so I actually want to interrupt with a follow-up question, I think for either Elise or Mike. Boulder County's approach to this, so your concern, Laurie, I think is really well taken, that like you have to have this stuff up in advance. So one of the things I really like about what Boulder did with their regulations was they put the onus on operators to demonstrate upfront what their proposed emissions were going to be through a model. And then they also require the hiring of a consultant to do some of this monitoring work. And so, Laurie, I know Broomfield has spent a small fortune on some of this monitoring stuff, but I'd love to hear Elise and Mike talk about ways to sort of shift the cost off of general taxpayers and onto the actual applicant who's going to be causing the harm. Because at least I know Boulder grappled with that directly in your regs, and Mike, I know you have some thoughts on that too.
Well, I'll just start off and say, yes, that's exactly what we did. We require throughout the regs, different studies be done, and we require the operator to pay for them, although we have some control over the actual studies, so they don't go out and just buy the results, but we require them to pay for that. So that includes sort of modeling for their proposed operation. Boulder County does continue to pay externally for the air quality monitor at the Boulder Revs, so that we have our own external sort of ongoing background data coming in, separate from any facility that would want to come in and be proposed. So we do a little bit of both, but we totally believed that the onus needs to be on the operator, both to prove that they're safe and to pay for the experts to prove that they're safe.
Yeah, it's been a continually frustrating problem where we're sort of socializing the cost of operations, and I know we want to get around that. So Mike, perhaps you just want to say ditto, but if you have any thoughts on cost defrayment off of taxpayers and onto applicants.
Well, this is an area that was specifically authorized by 181, and we put it in there for a reason, to make sure that there was no question that local governments could do what you've heard Boulder County is doing, and others are looking at as well. So have at it. I mean, there's some local governments that aren't doing it that way, but certainly the authority to do it is there.
Cool. Sorry to cut you off there, Laurie. That was really helpful, and I know we got about 15 minutes left. So I wonder if, Andrew, we can move to you to see what you think are some of the best examples that we've seen of regulatory efforts and successes in monitoring.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think I'll end up seconding most of what has, Laurie and Elise have talked about, and Mike, in terms of, the Boulder regs and the air monitoring, continuous air monitoring. But one thing I guess I want to do in terms of bringing this back to Larimer County, and where I see sort of Larimer County is in this kind of unique or important kind of moment right now, because they, as a county, they don't have a ton of current oil and gas development. There's a lot of old kind of vertical oil wells. There's not a ton of the horizontal drilling yet. And so they're in this moment where they can potentially get some strong regulations on the books in terms similar to Boulder County, in terms of being very protective of health and very much putting the onus on operators to prove that they're going to be protective of the health before some of this development actually really starts to occur in a massive way. And then on the other hand, moving towards the continuous air monitoring quality, one thing that Larimer County unfortunately does have to contend with at the moment, even if they don't have massive, horizontal drilling, is they have all of the pollution that is drifting their way from Weld County. And so getting some sort of continuous monitoring in place, whether it's Boulder Air or something similar, similar to what Boulder County has, could be very, very helpful and informative for the residents of Larimer who are sitting here, breathing air that they know is potentially being impacted by the neighboring jurisdiction, and wondering what exactly it is that they're dealing with. And it's hard sometimes, I think, for legislators and rule makers and regulators to make hard and fast decisions when there's this kind of dearth of data. So having something to look at, having that continuous air monitoring data as a reference point is really, really crucial. So Larimer County right now is at this pivotal sort of moment to make some of these really, really good, I think, moves in both of those spaces, building on the success of neighbors.
I think that's a really great point. And I think with that sense of collaboration and learning from others, I'd like to move into some Q&A. We did a really good job of third spouse sighting. Let's all wave to Laurie's background. I think we did a really good job of answering a lot of the questions that came up in the chat, either in the chat itself or throughout our discussion. So I want to thank, before everybody leaves, I want to thank Ed and Sarah of the Larimer Alliance for gathering these Q&A sessions, because I've demonstrated time and time again that I cannot be trusted with a chat while I'm presenting. So thank you for managing that, so I didn't have to do that. Thank you to all the attendees. We still have 33 people who are sticking around at 8:45 tonight. So thank you for doing that. And with that, let's move into the Q&A. I think, let's see. I don't know who this is best directed for, so maybe you guys can rock, paper, scissors for it on camera. But I think maybe the best summary question that we got was, and I'll paraphrase this lightly, is, in your view, who do you think bears the responsibility for the potential impact? Is it the state? Is it the COGCC, the AQCC, the operator themselves? Is it residents that live nearby? Like, how do we grapple with this question of sort of the socialized impacts of oil and gas development, and like where that all lives?
Well, I will start and say the operators are responsible for operating in a way that protects public health, safety, and the environment. And the state and local governments are responsible for making them do that, right? And having some compliance and enforcement. And the state really should ideally protect in a blanket way, but local governments have the authority and the responsibility to go above and beyond based on their particular community's needs, desires, and wants. And so Larimer County advocates out there, if you want greater protections, go demand that from your elected officials and partner with them to make that happen.
I'm waiting for one of the panelists to say that it lies with the people who live next door. Anybody want to take that take that approach? Andrew, Laurie, Andrew, I'd be curious to hear your non-elected view of this.
I mean, I'm going to second exactly what Elise just said. I mean, this lies entirely with the operators this is the sort of thing that when I'm talking to community members who are reaching out to us because of these concerns about this site, I always try to reassure them, and it may not be much consolation in the position that they're in, but reassure them that this, there is absolutely, or there should be it should not be their responsibility to prove that they're being impacted. The operator you know, the responsibility for this should lie on the operator. They should be proving that they're not causing harm to their neighboring residents and communities. The residents themselves shouldn't feel the need to document data, take pictures of nosebleeds, things like that, in order to prove that they're being harmed. That is just absolutely backwards. And it's, you know, part of why we've embarked on these rulemaking processes over the last year, is to make that no longer the case.
Mike, Laurie, anything to add? Mike, you're unmuted.
Yeah, so, you know, what I'll say is, Senate Bill 181 was designed to, and I think does enable this kind of paradigm shift. I mean, it's been decades, generations where the oil and gas industry just expects that they'll be able to privatize their gains and socialize the costs. There's an ability under 181 to flip that script, and that's a huge paradigm change. But it's going to take some effort to make sure that the state and the local governments actually take advantage of that paradigm change. I mean, you can put stuff down on paper that says change the way you think all you want, but if it's not actually enforced or carried out effectively, then it's not going to be as effective as it certainly could. So I'll just go back again to what I said before. It takes vigilance, it takes community involvement, and you're facing a lot of inertia. I mean, there's lots of people that, you know, they've operated in the old world for 20 years. I mean, this is what they're used to. They're used to the way that it was. And like anything, it's kind of hard to change that. It's kind of hard to change that inertia, to turn the ship. So it's just going to come to communities and involve persons to make sure that that actually happens, and that authority is carried out effectively.
Laurie, anything to add?
Not really. I think the way Elise laid it out is perfect. That is really what we're striving for and how it should be done. And then it's kind of that catch-up period of time where if you go back a few years ago, that's not how it felt at all. But change has, the landscape has changed, and that is now what we're striving for. And the operators are actually, you know, starting to wake up and realize that they do have to make those changes. And we saw that in the recent pneumatics rulemaking and others. So it is, but we need to keep, it has changed. We need to keep moving more and more in that direction of the ultimate responsibility lying on the operators and not the impacted communities.
So I'll take one last question, and it'll be for all of you as well. And I think I'll start with Andrew for this. What do you guys see as an impediment to taking some of these actions that we're taking? What's, if protecting public health and safety is the goal and air monitoring is a tool there, what do you see as an impediment to, you know, effective regulations that can really get us to accomplish this goal? And Andrew, yeah.
From our standpoint, it's the enforcement, honestly. I mean, we can enact the best regulations and have the best regulations on the books. If they're not properly enforced and not enforced in a strong and really just with no room for loopholes or wiggle room, then they're not going to mean much, and it's not going to really regain public trust in this process. And I think there's a lot of people who've been very disheartened over the years and years and years of activism. And even with the most recent rulemaking at the COGCC and, you know, everything with that effective date in January 15th, 2021 of all these rules supposedly becoming effective. And then we still have these giant new fracking developments in multiple communities around the Front Range that are far too close to homes. And it's because they were grandfathered in under the old permits, which is just not much consolation to communities. It's not much consolation at all, because they see that these new rules were enacted, and then the next thing they see is right next, 1,000 feet from their home is this brand new giant mega pad that would not have been permitted under the new rules. And so I think, one, being clear and communicating really what we're getting out of this process and what these regulations can and can't do and where we still need to go. And two, making sure that when they are on the books, they are properly enforced. Because we all have a responsibility to kind of continue to build the public trust in this process as well.
That's a really great point. Elise, I see you nodding along. Do you want to go next?
Well, and I would add to that the burden that's being borne by local government and elected officials is heavy. That, I mean, if you look like, you know, somebody at Laurie, you know, 10 years ago, you weren't talking about fracking, and now you have to be an expert, and you have to talk and all and dive deep in this stuff. And to expect every community to become oil and gas experts is a big lift. And until the state fully takes over that role, which, you know, we're making strides, we're not there yet, local governments have to do, and that is a lot to ask of local elected officials. Particularly, it's a little different for county commissioners. We get paid to work full-time on county stuff, but city council members and people like that are trying to do some of this for their communities, that is really, really hard. And that's why advocates, I think, play such an important role of helping provide that expertise and that backing to local elected officials who are being asked to do so much.
That's a really great point. Laurie, since you were just name checked there.
Yeah, thank you, Elise. That is kind of how it is. And some of us, you know, I made my way into politics, dealing with oil and gas development. So for me, this is like second nature to be doing this, but it is a heavy lift for a lot of city council members, especially those whose communities are not directly impacted by the oil and gas. That this is, and understand that dynamic of you have people who are voting on regulations and you know how sophisticated the air quality monitoring is going to be and other pieces of it when their constituents are not as immediately impacted as someone like myself. I have very impacted communities. I did want to add, I lost my train of thought here. There was another key piece. If I think of it, I'll come back to it. It was the existing. Here's a defining place that we're seeing Broomfield in is, you know, we understand, and with the powers given us by under 181 and these new regulations going forward, you know, if there was to be new oil and gas development, it would look completely different than it would have, you know, back pre-181. And so we have these contracts that were put in place prior to Senate Bill 181, and you have like legally binding agreements that very much hinder that ability to do things the way it would have been done when the local government has been given much more authority. And so those existing contracts continue to you know, to provide obstacles to protecting health and safety in some of these instances, especially where oil and gas development was done very close to communities. So I guess that was what I was going to add. So thank you.
Hold on, I'm proving that I can't be trusted with chat. Lauren Swain, you shared a bunch of stuff and you accidentally, I think, shared it with just the panelists. If you could reshare it with the attendees as well, I think people would benefit from seeing that. But Mike, I will give you the last word in response to this question, what you see is maybe impediments to this or building on what you've heard from Laurie and Elise. And Andrew, sorry.
I don't think this will come as any surprise given my prior remarks, but I think that one of the biggest impediments would be just the presumption that the operators get to drill and that their permits are to be accepted. Maybe they have to shift location here or there, but that presumption is alive and well. And I just don't think it's a valid presumption if they can't show that what they're doing is consistent with public health, safety, and welfare. So that's going to mean that some permits need to be denied, I think, at least, you know, based on what I'm hearing, may be submitted under certain circumstances that, you know, it hasn't been submitted in all fairness, but if some of these permits are resubmitted in the COGCC or to the COGCC or to local governments, under the current rules, they very well should be denied, I think, you know, if the evidence would turn out to be the way that I think it will, that it's not consistent with public health, safety, and welfare. So, but overcoming that presumption and that inertia is when you've got, say you're an elected official and, you know, you don't know all the ins and outs of oil and gas, but there's staff members that have been doing it for 20 years and they're telling you something, and you know it's hard to overcome that sometimes. But I think it needs to be done in order to really truly affect what 181 was designed to do.
That's a really great point. And I think with that, I will offer, in terms of wrap up, my sincere thank you to all of the attendees who joined us today. I think at one point we topped out about 55 people. This is a really important topic. I'm really grateful to all of you who tuned in to listen. I'm deeply grateful to the 4 panelists who joined us this evening. It's been a great conversation and a wonderful evening. I learned a lot. I hope people in attendance also learned a lot. I will add on to what Mr. Foote just said at the end. If you're a local elected official and you're struggling with some of this stuff, there are a ton of resources available to you. These panelists, Logic, the Larimer Alliance, Mike Foote in his various capacities, your fellow local electeds are a great resource. I know I've talked to a bunch of different local elected people who wish they had somebody to talk to about this. And I think there's a venue for all of you to speak to each other. Your emails are generally publicly available, so I'd encourage you to reach out to each other, because I know for a fact that a lot of you are struggling to talk to each other. And with that, I think I need to give Tim Gosar just a minute to wrap us all up.
Before we sign off, I'd just like to thank our great and august presenters tonight, Mike, Elise, Laurie, and both Andrews, and our partners, Earthworks and Logic. Thanks for your time, and more importantly, thanks for your amazing commitment to a cleaner and healthy Colorado. Finally, I'd like to thank our audience for your time, and extra time actually, for your support for our webinar. Remember, if you want to help us financially or with your time and energy, the Larimer Alliance would love to have your support. So with that, good evening and thank you.
Should we mention that the recording is going to be up on the Larimer Alliance website at some point?
That'd be great, Andrew. Yep, you've done it.
Cool. Mentioned. All right. With that, thanks everybody so much. And I think we can, Andrew Klooster, do you mind sticking around for a second to make sure we can get everything saved and recorded? And then with that, I think we can let everybody go.
Good night, everybody.
Good night,
Thanks.
everybody.
All right. Laurie, you just sticking her, oh, there she goes. Okay.